He can't conceive their shape, so he cannot present their illusion on a working surface, which is what artists do to a great extent. Well, before we do the head, let's take a look at the neck. Essentially, perhaps, to find out how we move our head this way, that way, and the other way. So we could draw a very simple mask-like head with a with an egg and a ball. And the ball we can sense in there, it's about 5 eyes in diameter, which makes a very nice measurement for a number of proportional problems. And as you probably know, most of you, this ball back here in feel is balanced on the backbone, which of course is on the human. And that affects the whole feel of our neck, you see. The way the spinal column or backbone affects the whole feel of the profile of the body. The pit of the neck would be about some movements more like that. The pit of the neck would be about 1 diameter under the ball. So this is a pretty big head I'm doing. Students have a hard time when they're looking at the shoulder girdle from this point of view, but I think the great trick is to think of that collarbone as a sort of a S-curved rubber hose, and to feel you're a little above it or below it. So if we could place the pit of the neck, which must be about here, we could perhaps feel that we're a little above the collarbone, and feel it come out at us that way. Back here, as you know, the circle of the first rib begins, I think in the artist's mind, at the tip of the 7th cervical dorsal spine. I think the constructional circle goes from there to the pit of the neck. It's not really the first rib, but the feel of the cylinder of the neck you take from this 7th cervical. It's a construction line, of course. There is, as a matter of fact, a strong cord. This head is broken sort of like that in the back, called the cervical ligament, that is in animals and us, and starts from the back of the head, goes into the 7th cervical. It's used in animals the same way it is in us. It's to keep our head upright, you know. The head has a tendency to fall forward, and I think it helps us keep it upright without too much effort. Of course, on horses and other animals have great big heads. They need an enormous, great big outbalanced heads, you know. They need an enormous cervical ligament. But on us, it doesn't take the outline the way it does on the animals. Because we have this feeling of 2 strong cords on each side of the back of the neck, you see. They're very deep. And when we look from the side, we see the top of one of these ropes rather than the hollow in between where the cervical ligament is. This shoulder blade here, its great quality is that it's a spiral plane. It starts off this way, you see, and ends up that way. So you spend a few years of your life drawing spirals, and lines run over conceived form, as you know, and you feel these spirals. I think this one will go around another cylinder. But you learn to throw spirals around the cylinders. And in this case, let me see how I'd feel it, yeah, about like this. In this case, you see, the feel of that thing is, that's the spine of the shoulder blade. You see, artists feel you draw lines on conceived form. These forms are practically always mass conceptions. You feel their shape and their direction, you run the line over it. So we feel the spine of the shoulder blade, something like this, and very quick cylindrical movement, spiral movement. Of course, there's a shoulder blade in there. It's easy to find out how tall it'll be, because it'll be as tall as the ball in the back of the head. Now, the great trapezius muscle, as you know, covers everything on the shoulder and creates the shoulders to a great extent. And it would, as I say, it would take over the center line there and come down and fasten itself into the spine of the shoulder blade. And then in front, it would come down and go into about 1/3 of the collarbone. Of course, the front point, the front plane changes here to a side plane. And that's what they call the high line. It's the line you'd see on the back, you see. If you draw the back of a figure, you feel the egg in front of that head, you see. And you feel the shoulder blade out here. And the line of the trapezius is that. And you take that line and you transfer it to here, and it comes out as a line like this, and naturally outlines you see like that are simply planes meeting planes. That's the great function of these supposed lines we draw. You know, they're not lines at all. They're great big three-dimensional pile-ups of charcoal. They're mental concepts that we give people of lines. When we use lines where planes meet, and the outline even is where the total back plane is meeting the total front plane. Well, that line transferred to this drawing becomes that. So we could, if there was a light coming from here, we could feel some shade on the back, you see. We could feel the front plane and the back plane. Now, as you know, we really have to draw rib cages when we're studying, because the great idea is to bring the neck out of the circle of the first two ribs, because it's through them that we swallow and we breathe. And we'd have a terrible time if the neck came out of anywhere else. You see the circle of the first ribs? We have the swallowing tube goes in there and the breathing tube. The swallowing tube lies pretty flat against the backbone, but the breathing tube, artists have to think of, the windpipe, of course. It has to be rigid. Otherwise, we'd expire when we exhaled, you know, it would flatten itself together. And so we think of we might feel the jawline a little more precisely, maybe even tip the head up a touch. We think of a nice tube coming down here against the vertebral column, you see. I suppose about like that. And plunging into the rib cage so you can breathe. So you see, it's a good thing to throw rib cages in for a few years at the school, because then you know where to bring the neck out. You won't bring it out of the side of the shoulder or something. Now, this tube, as I say, has to be kept rigid and open. And so there are various bands and rings and things around it, including the Adam's apple, to keep it in that condition. The first thing we find is a bone that goes around it like a horseshoe. And that is hung, you might say, on a sort of a ligamentous muscle. It comes out of a little spike here that artists know about, which is called the styloid process, this little spike here. And I guess would be about here. And that becomes a line we use, you see, when you throw the head up. You run from one styloid process to the other, and you get the line that separates the plane under the jaw from the neck, you see. This line here. Maybe I ought to give you a feel of it. We throw up the head, you see. Mouth will be strongly curved. And we get this feel like that. Neck's coming down here. And this becomes a strong underplane on which, if you're wise, you move from dark to light. You send it back. And this line here just runs from styloid to styloid around the hyoid. The floor here of the mouth, or whatever you want to call it, floor of the jaw, is made up of very small muscles that open our jaw. You see, we're not required to have much power to open our jaw. Frankly, gravity will open it if you're standing up. But some of you know if you get mixed up with a caramel or something, it's quite hard to open your jaw. And that's because the muscles are so weak. You can learn them individually, but I never thought it was much good. They just run from the jaw to the hyoid bone, you see. And they make that plane in there. After the hyoid, we have the Adam's apple, which, despite the authorities, is in both men and women, but much more delicate in women. It's cartilaginous, sort of a shield-like form you'll see from the front. Then around here is the first visible ring, which is called the cricoid cartilage. That means a seal ring in Greek. It has a little bump on the back. And then there are others around the windpipe, but you never know how many, because you could pull that windpipe out of the rib cage if you raise your head. Or if you put your head way down like that, you push it way down. I think almost everybody knows this great muscle here. It used to be a student's favorite. It's called the sternomastoid. And here's a case where the name helps you draw it. It runs from the sternum, you see, to the mastoid bone. That's this bump here, the mastoid bone. There's a great big bump about here. And the way artists think of it, they think of it as spiraling around the cylinder of the neck. And it goes directly, the main part of it, to the pit of the neck. Turns into a sharp little tendon on the bottom there. Technically, its name is sternocleidomastoid. And that's because cleido means collarbone. It has a big piece that goes down to the collarbone as well. Goes in there. And those two pieces mold together, you see. Well, that's about all people, artists, know, I think. You'll see a little detail or so in there occasionally, but you can pick them up in the books, the scalenus muscles. Not very important. Of course, the edge is not sharp the way I've drawn it there. The contour line curves over, you see. Falls into quite a hollow there, called the salt box. Well, I think I'll go back to the skeleton again. Egg in the ball, I bring the bone down, and we've very carefully examined the two top bones, the one that supports the head and the one underneath. They're called the atlas and the axis. Naturally, Atlas supported the world. That's why perhaps we should take the feel of that imaginary ball in there very seriously, because it undoubtedly goes back to classic times, because the name of the bone goes way back. Well, now that atlas, if we get above it and look at it, that's the first bone. It's really just a ring. And it has in the middle a hole for the actual column of nerves, you know. But here there's a little hollow, and here there's a hollow. If we could look at the bottom of this head, indeed we can, we'd see a couple of little knuckles there, one on each side. And what happens, you see, is that when you nod your head, you just rock back and forth on the very top of the backbone. That's the way you say yes, you see. Sort of like a rocking chair. From the front view, you just do that. Now, underneath that is a bone called the axis, which is much the same as this, except it has a sort of a rhinoceros horn on it. It goes up like that. And that fits under here. And we might see a little tip of the horn. The horn is held in place by cartilage. And what happens there is that the atlas turns or grinds, really, on the axis. And that's the way you say no, you see. You can say no, and you can say yes, if you wish. The rest of the backbone, you don't have to study too much. You can consider it a sort of a piece of rubber hose. You can move in heavy rubber hose. You move any direction you want. But those two top bones have specific movement. And you know, theoretically, you have to fit the head on the backbone in a certain way. And traditional artists know this. You see, you can put your head way to one side, and you can say yes if you wish, or no. Or way in front, you see. You find it's much easier to say yes than no. It's a grinding motion, which is probably why we're all here, I suppose. Saying no is quite hard. It's the quality that great executives have, you know, they're paid for. On the front view, we'd have the feeling of the egg in front and the ball behind. The ball is wider and bigger than the egg, wider in diameter. And the pit of the neck would be about here. And of course, if you remember your detail here, you run into the sternum bone, or to be more exact, the first piece of the sternum, which is called the manubrium. And we get in our minds this circle of the base of the neck, which is a sort of a translation of the first two ribs. And we get the feel of the neck as a cylinder, you see, coming down. Now, the collarbones, again, if you draw them as a straight line, you're throwing away the illusion of shape. Because the straight line gives the illusion of flat form, you know. So again, if you see them as a straight line, you do sometimes, you're on the same level. Feel yourself a little above or a little below the collarbone so as to carry the shape here, you see. And let's pretend we're a touch above, and we'd find our collarbone as a little sort of a knob on the top of it and goes off like that. The distance from the pit of the neck to the point of the shoulder is about the width of the ball. That's the point of the shoulder, that's this thing. And there's a collarbone on the other side, doubtless. Now, of course, from the front, perhaps we can think in through there and feel the atlas bone. And perhaps we can feel the cross axis of the atlas bone. And then underneath that, we might be able to feel the axis bone. Unfortunately, I have to use the word axis there and axis for that bone. And we get a great academic rule, and that is to throw the head perfectly on the neck. The axis of the eyes, that's the line like this, you see, that goes through the corner of the eyes, must be parallel to the axis of the atlas bone. In other words, here the axis of the eyes would have to be that. If we have a head like this, you see the axis of the eyes has to be that, the axis of the atlas in there has to be that, and the head would have to, if it's a front view, would have to curve down like this. So you have to feel the whole curve of the head coming through. As I say, that's ancient traditional rule, and maybe now you can see why Modigliani caused such a furor among the traditionalists, because he would draw a front head and he would give it a great tilt. See, like this. And then he'd put a straight neck on it. Then he'd put a straight neck on it and give you a front view, you see. And give you a front view. And yet he'd shoot his eyes that way. And that absolutely threw the academics into a panic. And other people said he was terribly courageous because he was breaking the rules, you see. But you know, it's awfully hard to break the rules unless you know what they are. That's one of the problems in art. Just the way it's awfully hard to cheat unless you know what the rules are, you know. Though breaking them isn't necessarily cheating them in art, you know. Well, we'll rub this ghost out and put the head in, maybe throw the jaw up a touch. It's going to be a mouth. The eyes will be up now. And we can imagine or feel the windpipe in there. And we can imagine the hyoid going around it, you see. Which is really like a horseshoe. And we can put our pencil on the feel of the styloid, you see, and get that plane again. We know that's all dark under the jaw. Then from the front we'll find the Adam's apple looks a little like a medieval shield with a pronounced break down the front, you see, giving it a front and side plane. That would come next. And then below that we'd begin to see these wings expressing the curve of the neck. As I say, you can't tell how many you'll see because you can feel yourself pushing that windpipe in between the ribs as you put your head down. The sternomastoid is starting at the mastoid, which we can feel back there, and you can feel it spiraling around the cylinder of the neck, you see, to its insertion in the sternum. And now we begin to see what the pit of the neck is. It's actually the two strong little tendons of the sternomastoid muscle, the floor of which, of course, is the manubrium bone. The clavicular portion of sternomastoid comes down like this. It goes in about there. Giving the muscle a convex feel to the outside, you see. And those two heads together can do all sorts of things. They can pull your head forward, they can rotate the head on the neck, and very valuable they are. Of course, students must fully realize that though the sternomastoid is a fascinating muscle, the mass of the neck is more important than the sternomastoid, especially in terms of light and shade. And you mustn't bring it out too much, because you get a terribly scrawny effect if you do, you know. It is a detail, after all, on the great cylinder of the neck. Now, artists often run a rhythm from shoulder blade to shoulder blade behind the neck, or from shoulder point to shoulder point. And on that they place the trapezius, you see. You find the trapezius grows in the bone about 1/3, and you've got a hollow in here, which is called the salt box, that you often see on the model, which of course is more pronounced when the shoulders are raised. Notice that movement. You see, every beginner in the world will draw a head, and they certainly won't draw it in mass the way I am, but they'll all do this immediately. See that concave? Now we know that it's made up of two convexes, you see, sternomastoid and trapezius. Of course, the beginner continues his picture like that. They just love concaves, you see. But you begin to see what you know. You know there's a rib cage in there, you see, and the rib cage comes out like that. You see, so that's convex to the outside. Then, of course, you're all so sophisticated, you know what that is. And you know what this is, you know what that is, you see. And the beginner's line, you see, which is like that, to the trained artist becomes a series of convexes to the outside, because he knows the forms exist. There's probably hardly a layman that's ever heard of this thing, or that thing, or that thing, you see. You really can only draw what you know, you see, which is one of the great reasons for studying artistic anatomy when it comes to drawing the figure. Well, I think that's pretty much the anatomical story of the neck. And the head is hard and will take time, so let's attack the head itself. Of course, as you know, what an artist looks for first is the great simple mass that he draws from his mass conceptions, which are these curious geometrical shapes he has in his mind of the block and the sphere, the ovoid or egg, the cylinder, all those things. And his first feel, of course, is the mass of the skull would be a ball and an egg, one in front of the other. Beginners invariably cut the ball off the back of the head, or a good piece of it. I don't know why, but they all do, generally except for mothers. And I know why they don't do it is because they've had these babies in their laps, you see, and they can see this enormous distance from here to here from the top, and they don't cut off the back of the head. So there's an argument for motherhood. Now, probably the hardest thing to do when you draw a head is to throw them in different positions. You know, this way and that. And of all these mass conceptions we have, the one that gives you the best direction and position and aspect is the rectangular solid. So if you can conceive of your head in a rectangular solid, so much the better. In terms of proportion, as people know, is a complex subject, but essentially one has to have some ideal of the normal in mind, otherwise you can't see what's abnormal, you see. So you yourself invent a normal figure. You have in your mind a secret figure, so you can look at the model and you can see what's normal on the model and what isn't, you see, according to your secret figure. But many of the things on the model will be the same as the secret figure, because from the point of view of the skeleton, the proportion proportions in height are remarkably similar from skeleton to skeleton. So you spend quite a lot of time in your secret figure on the skeleton itself, and be sure that your landmarks are skeletal. That's why I'm rather against the head measurement, which so many artists use, because it keeps hitting fleshy landmarks like nipples, you know, navel. God knows nipple can be anywhere as you grow older. The navel, too, moves around like a traveling salesman, might be anywhere. They're not good landmarks, you know. But the skeletal landmarks are very consistent. Well, we can, as you know now, I guess, put that ball in a cube. And the distance across the ball is 5 eyes. The eye makes a nice little measurement at times for small things, like, say, the distance of the upper pelvic point from the lower one there, and things of that sort. Then we come out one eye, and then we drop down here 2 eyes, and we get a very acceptable head block. It shows my egg was off here, you see. The front view of that block, of course, would be 5 across. Must be about that, and 7 down, strange enough. That's 7. Oh, this when I rub out the 5 will be 6. 6 eyes. Now, all these things are just suggestions. People make up their own secret figures. But I've had very good luck at times with the 5-eyed measurement, or the width of the head is what it is. The diameter of that ball. Well, again, you can feel the ball in the back, and you can feel the egg in front, you see. A little narrower. The egg is narrower than the ball. The great width of the head is in the back, you know. See, my head is widest back here. Very narrow here. That means, I suppose, it'd be pretty wise to work on a top view, with 5 across and 6 down, be about that. Then you can feel the ball in the back, and you'll find that you narrow out very considerably as you come around here to the front of the face. Even the front of the face is pretty curved, not so much on those superorbitals. Probably very accurately a little more like that. The ears, of course, would be coming out of the box. Don't let that bother you. And the nose would come out in front, but don't let that bother you. These blocks are not totally encasing very often. Things stick out of them, but we accept them. Can't have everything. If you're going to draw a moose's head, you can block it up, but undoubtedly the horns will stick out, you know. Moose's horns are very interesting for the artist. You know that they're drawn on a bowl conception. The whole feel of the moose's horns seems to go over the feel of a sort of a salad bowl. In other words, if we had a moose, which is not very likely, if we had a moose, you see, we might feel the moose's head as a kind of an egg-like form, and then we could put a salad bowl up here, and his horns would come up and they'd branch all over the salad bowl, you see. But they would, it'd be the same on the other side. But the form of the moose's horns you draw over the salad bowl, if you're ever likely to draw a moose. Well, I suppose we could put in a detail or so before we have a recess. The highest part of the skull is back here. And then it begins to go downhill, and you've got a sudden break here. And we can begin to work in eyes, if we wish. That break I've made too high for the average. That break there is called the widow's peak, strangely enough. To me, it's a break in planes, though it would be very often where the hair starts, you see. But I feel it's a break from this plane to that plane. Then we'd get a big bulge in front here. But before we do that, let's use the famous art school rule of 3, which is 3 equals, you see, from the widow's peak down. That means there are 2 eyes each. And we find we come down here and we get what they call the supraorbital eminence, the bulging there on the skull. Never so good on these plastic things, but all animals have a eminence over the eyes, of course, to protect the eyes from damage. And we have too, though it may be very subtle in young people. These bumps here. Then there's a very swift going back right here on a down plane that we call the glabella. And then there's an immediate emergence of the little nasal bone. And we play around the nasal orifice. That down plane there, that up plane there, of course, are very well known to artists because of light problems. And they try to cast shadow off the nasal bone. Of course, if you study animal skulls, it may help a bit because occasionally on the animals, things are enormous. Look at that horse's nasal bone. Why, compared to ours? Ours is just a little thing, you see. The horses is tremendous. Look at that nasal bone. So it's not bad to study animals because occasionally you find things that are details in us very large in the animals. Well, like our tail, just a detail. No, nothing with that. But you know, some animals have beautiful tails. We then come down here and we run into the teeth. Now, here's where we mustn't follow the writers, because they never seem to think about shape, you know. The writers, of course, say her teeth were like a string of pearls. Well, they're nothing of the sort, I assure you, because her teeth are all adjusted according to function. You see, the two teeth on the side of the center are for cutting. And then she has the canine tooth, which is a weapon of defense and becomes the tusk of the saber-toothed tiger and the tusk of the walrus, you see. So you look at her teeth very carefully before you say they're a string of pearls. Then she has a couple of molars here called the bicuspids, and 3 more to grind the food with, like there. And the same ones underneath. There's a line here called the temporal oval, and that comes down and plays around the orbit, which we'll examine much more in the front. And then it goes back very suddenly on a beautiful line for us, because that's the depth line, you see. The depth line of the mass, this line here. The top of the zygomatic arch, that's a real arch there, you see. Then there's a little place for the cavity for the jaw. Then the thing moves along like this and creates the cheekbone. And again, we find a nice landmark, which is the point of the cheekbone. The reason that's a beautiful landmark is because coming up from this point is a very definite line, like that, where the front plane of the face meets the side plane, or the front plane of the head meets the side plane, where the major light plane in front meets the major light plane on the side. The skin is very thinly put over this bone here, so that break is very obvious, and so is the point at the end of the break, and it's used a great deal by artists. The movement of the jawbone is studied by artists. If it's very developed as this, the teeth are all in here. But this is the official point of the jaw. As skulls are less developed, you just feel the point of the jaw. And of course that's a landmark because that's supposed to be on the same level as the mouth, you see. I don't think this one is very good because I think they're stressing this point more than that one. But the average art student feels the point of the jaw is on the level with the mouth. So we can put the jaw into what they call the glenoid cavity, that just being shallow, and point it up there and bring it around. And then we can come here and put that bump on there and bring that line down. The mastoid bone is back here, and I think sort of falls through the rule of 3 we've established in front. And that little spike, if we could see it, the styloid would be in there. So those are pretty much the details of the skull that the artist knows. The high point, which is above the mastoid. The widow's peak. You see, that's one eye down. Then we have this rule of 3 that works so well with the flesh face. It must be 2 eyes each. We come down on the frontal eminence, and we see this supraorbital bump, and we go back on the glabella, out on the nasal bone, and we can feel the orifice of the nose. We put in a few teeth. We note the angle of the jaw, the point of the cheekbone, the orbits we'll talk about a little more in the front view, and mastoid. The head sticks out in the back about the level of the top of the nose. Well, there's a little explanation of the skull. Let's have a little recess, and I'll come back. We do the front of the skull and a few other things. Well, turn to the front of the skull. You might run a center line right down the center. And we can transfer these lines, you see, into width lines. I get the rule of 3 in front, and it'll help us with the skull, but it'll also help us greatly with the face. This glabella here is a keystone-like form that takes shade, of course, because it's a down plane. You see, the reason you have to think like an architect, front and side, and even plan if you can, one of the great reasons is you can see the up planes and the down planes very clearly on the side view. But if I draw the little nasal bone in here, you have to think it, you see. That means I can put some shade on the glabella, which is a down plane. And if I haven't been trained, there'll be a mass of cast shadow on the nasal bone. But if I've been trained, I'll obliterate that because I won't be able to feel the up-like thrust of the nasal bone, you see. I don't know why beginners have such terrible trouble with cast shadow, but they do. It's because they have to copy what they see. They just love cast shadows the way they love their mothers and their grandmothers and their mistresses and all that sort of thing. They just love cast shadows, and they will not eliminate them. And yet, if you go through the history of art, I'd just love to have you point them out to me in Egyptian art or Persian art or Japanese art or a great many other art movements. I mean, all those artists knew that a cast shadow destroyed the form in which it fell and had to be handled very, very delicately. The way you have to handle your mother, your grandmother, and your mistress, I may say. Then we take a ride around the nasal orifice, pleasant little trip, and see, that's that on the front view. And we get down to all these teeth here, the two incisors and the canine, and the molars going back, and the reflecting ones underneath. We get quite an idea from here. You see, you have two incisors, and you have one canine, and you have two bicuspids, and you have three molars. That's what they call the dental formula. And those people that go out, dig up old skeletons, you often wonder how they identify them. Very frequently by the dental formula I show you. This is also the dental formula of the New World apes, but not the Old World apes. So make what you can out of that, you Darwinians that are here. The orbits of the eye are quite fascinating. From the front, they are a horizontal and oblique, a vertical and an oblique, and a very mild oblique going up. That's from the front. But as we see later, the front of the head is cylindrical, and that orbit is drawn on a cylinder. And so everything is different from what you think it is when the head is tilted this way or that. The widow's peak is about one eye down, about here. That's that point, you see. This temporal oval line here, we can see from the front coming around and playing around the orbits. And then we go back very quickly on this line here. Orbit should be a little further out, I think, to the normal here. So very quickly back on that line. And we come down and we catch the point of the cheekbone on the line of the nose, on the width line of the nose. As we'll see next week, yes, these are width lines of the mass. And these are depth lines of the mass, you see. Those are the principal ones. The ear fits in here, you know. And artists think so much when they get going draftsmanship in terms of height lines, width lines, depth lines of the mass, because of the line systems of rectangular blocks. You have three, you see. The height system, the width system, the depth system. And as you get into perspective, of course, those become very important. And most of the time you just take a ride on a line from the line system is all I can say as drawing goes on. I brought that in too much there, it didn't come in that much. And we play around the orbit, go back on the zygomatic and try to catch the point of the cheekbone. About there, I think. The jaw is fitted in underneath there. We got the point of the jaw. There's a great sexual difference there. On women, The points of the jaw are quite near together, and on men they're wide, relatively, you know. Now, this doesn't look much like a skull till I get this line in, you see. Then it begins to look like a skull very much. A few more teeth back there. The line comes forward nicely. Now, up here, there is a big bump, which is mirrored here, called the frontal eminence. And above the orbits are the supraorbital eminences, the inner eminence, which is quite large, and the outer eminence. It's about that. I don't know anything that gives more character to a face than an understanding of those two eminences. You see, in people whose skull is not overdeveloped, a good deal like this one here, frankly, you can't see them very clearly. But in older people, possibly like myself, you see these eminences, especially males, these eminences are very clear. Now, everybody has them. But it's another case if you can't draw them unless you know they're there. So if you buy a skull for study, get some fine old elderly truck driver or something, you know, a good tough one, and the bumps will be very clear. Well, to go over these things again that artists seem to know, the frontal eminence, the supraorbital eminence, which is divided into the inner one and the outer, the orbits of the eyes we talk about a little more, the glabella, little down plane on the skeleton, the nasal bone, the orifice of the nose, feel of the teeth, of course. This line here from the front you study, you see. Bring it down, send it back. The cheekbone is very important, of course, in drawing the head, especially because of the little line where the planes break. The lower jaw, I think people study a good deal to get this line here. So that line that's very subtle. But it's very subtle because you think it's the bone, you know, but as people get older, they get folds of flesh around there. And what this line becomes later on is the plane break, you see, of the light plane between here and here, where the two meet. That's the line you eventually draw, because you draw lines where planes meet. And planes are very often created by light. And the light is very often created by the artist, if an artist is trained. Well, there's your skull. Let's look at a few muscles on the skull. Of course, we have to close the jaw. That's very important. Close the jaw. And we have a muscle that grows out of this temporal place here and goes down behind the arch and goes into this coronoid process on the lower jaw. It's called the temporalis. And if you close your jaw very hard, you'll feel it swelling out here. It's a muscle that collects here, you see, and comes down. And all the fibers come down this way. And they go underneath the jawbone and go into that little coronoid process. And that's called the temporalis muscle. And it closes the jaw. Incidentally, these muscles that we put on the face are divided into the muscles of shape and the muscles of expression. You see, there are muscles that make us smile and frown and that sort of thing. But there's a great muscle here that I just gave you that really gives shape to the head and rounds out the feeling of this ball, you see. You can see it in animals. Go and if you have a cow, just watch the cow chewing a cud. And watch the temporalis, which is much more on the top of her head, swell and fall as she chews the cud, you see. Now, we have a second, the function of biting is so important for us. You know, we have to bite bones and get the marrow out. But we have two muscles that close our jaw. The other one is called the masseter. It comes from the cheekbone, goes right back to the jawbone that way. Oh, I guess about so far. That again is a muscle of shape. And notice that on animals very much. Take a look at the next bulldog you see. Look at his great big masseter. It's occasionally used as a muscle of expression by strong, silent Hollywood actors like Humphrey, you remember? Humphrey didn't like to, he had what they call the deadpan, which I think is probably an expression of the technical age, the machine age, you know. Machines have no expression. But Humphrey got it about first. Though there was another one named Bill Hart, I think might have got it before Humphrey did. Any movie experts here? And Humphrey just hated to show an expression, but under stress of enormous emotion, he would use the masseter muscle. I don't know if you can see anything here, but you just get a little sort of a quiver in the jaw, as the writers say, not knowing anything about it, but that's what they say. And that's what Humphrey would use when he was in vast trouble in the moving pictures. Now, all the other muscles are muscles of expression, muscles of emotion, you know. First of all, we have a round muscle that interthreads the eyelid and fills up all this space here. And it's called, that's a terrible name, it's called orbicularis palpebrarum. That means, palpebrarum means eyelids. The fibers go through the eyelids, actually, and that's the way you close your eyes, frankly. You open them, if you go into the anatomy books, with a muscle that goes way over the ball and comes to the front, pulls the eye open. We have the same thing around the mouth, a circular muscle. And that interthreads the lips and makes the mouth very mobile. You have to realize that individual fibers in individual muscles are under the fibers are under individual control. And that's why we can do such extraordinary things with our mouths, you see. You know, individual neurons fire back here and send messages down to individual fibers. They're all very well trained, as I think I said the other day. We then have running from, this one is called orbicularis oris. Oris means mouth, of course. Orbicularis oris. We then have running from the cheekbone to that muscle. Think how odd that is, because all the muscles we've been dealing with have been running from bone to bone. But these facial muscles often just interthread the skin, or they run from bone to muscle or something like that. That's called the zygomatic muscle. That's the smiling muscle. One on the other side. Now, wrinkles form across the pull of muscles. That's why we have a strong wrinkle here, you see, on account of the zygomatic and its neighbors. That's the zygomatic fold, they call it. Well, that is the smiling muscle. That makes you smile. See, that puts this up here. But when you smile, you engage this orbicularis up here, and you get little wrinkles in here, if it's a true smile. If it's a fake smile, it's just nothing here at all. So you can tell, you know, the true from the others by watching their smiles. I remember coming back from Greece a couple of summers ago. We were in the airplane, and the pilot said in his folksy way, "Folks, just got a message from the airport that there's a bomb aboard this plane." But he said, "I wouldn't worry, folks. We've looked up above the seats and in the toilets and down in the hole. We looked all over the plane and we can't find any bombs, so just don't worry. But we will put down in London before we, in Ireland before we go to America." And at that point, I noticed the stewardesses were walking up and down the aisle, and to reassure us, they were giving us... but I didn't feel so reassured, because there had a lot of trouble right about that time. In fact, the plane before me had been blown up and fallen into the sea. There was a plane that departed at that same time the day before. Well, now, right next to that, there's another little muscle from the cheekbone to the Nicolaides, which, strange enough, is a muscle of grief. Little muscle of grief. You know, people just pull up the lips slightly there, you get the feeling of sorrow. Next to that is a muscle with an old evolutionary history. It's called by the artist, it's called the snarling muscle. It comes out over the canine tooth. And very evidently the animals used to bare their canine teeth to frighten each other, you see. And we still do. The canine is about here. A little canal that moves in. And it pulls up the lip over the canine tooth, you see. Again, the writers say she gave him a dirty look. All she did was that, you see. No look at all. It's just the snarling muscle in operation. Well, there you have them. That's the smiling muscle. That's zygomatic major. That's zygomatic minor, which is a muscle of grief. So you see that tears and laughter are very close together there. The snarling muscle, I've observed that New Yorkers seem to use this snarling muscle here and that grief muscle both at the same time. That's their attitude in a way. They go around from this way. That's probably cynicism, I guess. Now, another muscle of grief is the depressor of the corners of the lips, which we should remember, because when we do the forms of the face, we'll find a bump there. That just pulls down that's the muscle of sorrow, you see. And then there's one in the middle, strange enough, called the elevator of the chin, but it really depresses the mouth and forms very much the bump of the chin on the flesh figure. That's grief, too. Running right through the skin of the forehead, there are fibers that the artists call this muscle the muscle of attention. Because you see, if you pay attention, you get these wrinkles there. That's frontalis. Directly below that is the muscle of reflection. In the books it's called the corrugator. Little fibers in the skin run that way. And they give you this big, maybe one or two wrinkles here. The corrugator. That's the muscle of reflection. You see, you pay attention, and then you reflect. See how they work? Running down the side of the nose, picking up the nostril and picking up the lip, is what artists call the muscle of pride. Runs right down here. But you can see where that comes from the evolutionary point of view. If you give your dog a plate of ill-smelling food, he'll draw his nose and his lip away from it, you see. And we do the same thing to people that we want to make feel like a plate of ill-smelling food, perhaps. Well, people do that. Head waiters and others, muscle of pride. Well, that's the basis of it. They're in a lot of books, of course, these muscles, if you want to study them. But you have to realize they can work together for compound expressions. And I've told various stories through the years to bring out some of these compound expressions. but the one I like is the banker's smile. You know, you go to the banker, perhaps you're dressed like an artist, and but a lot of people are these days, you know. He doesn't know how much money you have, but he wants to smile at you anyway because you might be a possible customer. But he wants to reflect on the matter at the same time, so he goes, you see? And he says, I'm very glad to meet you. He says, Mr. And you say to him, my name is Getty. Now, watch the banker. Attention. Astonishment, you see. The opening of the mouth has a lot to do with emotion. We're awfully prone to draw our models with the mouth firmly closed all the time, but just a little opening of the mouth will give some sort of feeling of emotion, you know. And the banker's astonished. He may be a little suspicious. You see, that's reflection and attention. But finally, he gives you a true smile, you see. He says, how nice to have you, Mr. Getty. You're in the oil business, I suppose. And you say, no, actually, I don't do any work at all. And the banker says, well, inherited money, no doubt. And you say, no, I've been on relief for about 11 months. Then watch the banker. All these things we've been talking about, you see, disgust, grief, torture, you know, all these things. You could get a mirror and learn these muscles a bit, and you'll find that you can cook up any expression you want. This knowledge, of course, is very valuable for cartoonists and characterists and many other people who wish to get a little expression in the face. But as I say, it's all in the books if you wish it. Especially in a book by Sir Charles Bell called The Expression of Emotion in Men and Animals. The history of the dissection of these muscles is very, very interesting. I wish I could go into it, but if you've done dissecting, you know they're very hard to find. And they were brought out at the beginning of the 19th century when they were able to give slight electric shocks to individual muscles. And they give them to paralyzed people, you see, and they get expressions. It's the way they isolated the expressional quality of these muscles. Well, we've got a moment left. I think what I'll do is go after the whole feel of the head of the skull. There's a little of the theory. Of course, if we want to draw a skull, we can start off, if we wish, with an egg and a ball. And we get a general feeling of the skull looking off in this direction, but not an exact feeling. Because the thing about these mass conceptions is the only one that gives you precise aspect and position or direction is the block. So you see, we immediately begin to block it up according to some formula. We draw a center line, say, and a line through the top of that, and we get our front plane, and then we send a line back, that's the depth line, and we get the whole front plane of the head. We have a rough feeling, if we know these things pretty well here. See, that's 7. We have a rough feeling about the size of this box in this position, especially if we've thought about these matters a bit. Now, again, we can look at this center line. We can pick off these points, you see, or get these width lines if we wish. And notice, of course, that they are all parallel to the width lines of our block. You see, massing, which that's called, blocking, it's also called, solves all sorts of draftsman's problems. There's not a beginner alive when he draws the head, doesn't do. He puts an eye here, another one there, and he makes the nose go that way and the mouth go this way. He puts one ear up here and one down there, you see. He doesn't feel the width lines that control all those things. He doesn't think in terms of blocks or mass, unless he's trained. There is, for instance, a width line that goes right through here to the other side of the box. And that's the eye line. And if you wish, you can hang 5 eyes on it with an eye between eyes. It'll all come out perfectly. You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You see it's back a bit. That's hard for beginners to see. But that's a real block of ice, remember. Now, I was going after those orbits. That drawing depends on this phenomena, which artists are very familiar with. If you have cylinders in different positions, lines running over them will be different. You see, here's a cylinder, and we might put a rubber band around it. A horizontal rubber band will go that way. But on a cylinder slightly up, of course, the band goes that way. And one slightly down, the rubber band goes that way. Run it around the back if you want to feel form in your practice. Look at the front of the head here. See how cylindrical it is. That's the orbit on the outside. Supposing you drew those lines on a cylinder. You see, the first line is horizontal here. But what is a horizontal here? We're doing a 3/4, incidentally. What is a horizontal here? It has a little upward curve, you see. How about this next line? It's a rubber band around the cylinder, you see. It has a little downward curve. The vertical will remain vertical, like the axis of the cylinder. But here comes a rubber band around the cylinder. See the way an artist thinks in terms of construction? And so he feels in this block a great cylinder, you see, going in a certain direction. Feels it in there. And when he draws those orbits, he instinctively draws the line over the form, you see. As if you're running rubber bands around the cylinder, he feels inside that block. This one over here is very peculiar, because perhaps you can see here that first we go this way, the first line. The next rubber band would come around and would about hit there and go that way. And the next one would come from the back and come around and go that way. Those things have to be practiced a lot, I think, for draftsmanship. So then, of course, we find the top line of the orbit is very important because the eyebrows follow it. You see, the eyebrows follow this line and that line. The reason being, of course, that's the part that juts forward the most on the skeleton. And the eyebrows are there to collect any sweat or dirt or anything, or rain that comes down here. And it's led to the side of the eye, you see. It doesn't get in your eye. They're functional. But you have to be careful of that rule, because the eyebrows are affected by emotion. And there are some people who are surprised all their life, so their eyebrows get stuck a little above the orbit, you see. Other very reflective people, the eyebrows get below the orbit. I would say that a portrait painter, if he were on his toes, would go up and actually touch his model to see how the eyebrows attune to the orbit itself. That same feel or rule you would apply to the, oh, well, we draw a little more skull here. There's the glabella. And if we wish to put a nose on there, we'll take this up next time. Just come out a little on a depth line, you see. We know our depth line. They just come out a little and draw a triangle from above. But we take that up next time, because we do the flesh nose. We find the nose will be going like that. But it's the mouth I'm after. The mouth, of course, runs over the teeth. And the teeth are cylindrical. If you don't believe it, just take them out and show them to your next-door neighbor. Maybe there aren't many people here who can do that outside of your lecturer. I don't know. But I assure you, teeth are very cylindrical. So therefore, when you draw the central line of the lips, you have to watch very carefully to see how the head is tipped. Because if the head is tipped down, it's going to be like that. In other words, there's a little imaginary tin can in here that goes in the same direction as the block, you see. And the center line of the mouth has to go over that. If it's tipped down, it would go that way. If it's tipped up, it would go that way. These are things you can't see, you know. And they're put in by knowing. You know, an untrained artist wouldn't see the difference between this much of a tip and that much. But the trained one does, you see, because he knows these draftsmen's ideas, which are very old, I may say, very old. Well, the temporal line isn't too hard to get, but might be interesting because we watch ourselves taking a ride on a depth line in order to get this line here, which is the one of the few anatomical depth lines on the head. In fact, the only one I know of, you see. And we come around and we get the points of the cheekbone. They're about in line with the bottom of the nose. They're on this line here, you see. Of course, they'd be a little on the circle. The point of the jaw would be still on the cylinder, about there. Well, it's sort of half skull, half fleshed. The ball you'd feel in there, and the mastoid would come through, and so on, and you begin to get a little feel of a skull. These bumps for character and expression are extremely important. The inner supraorbital and the outer supraorbital and the frontal eminence. Of course, the skull won't have any widow's peak, but there'll be a change on the plane there, as you can feel as you come down and go over. This point of the cheekbone, which frankly we get on a height line from the just between the orbit and the corner of the eye, you know. So that shows you how you use these lines for draftsmanship. You see, you have height lines, width lines, depth lines. Just drop a line a little outside the corner of the eye and get your point of your cheekbone. That's very valuable on this side, because when you're drawing a fleshed head, it's awfully hard to come down here, you know. But you know that point will be on the outline. Well, that's half fleshed, half dead. Well, I think our time is about up, and as I say, it's all, these are the facts, you see. But they're true enough. I often think that this Art Students League is a very peculiar place. It's a kind of a sanctuary, you know, here against the money grubbers and the power grabbers. And I know I spent 4.5 years here. I think they were perhaps the happiest time of my life. And we tried to tell the truth to each other, more or less. And we were isolated here in this league. Later on, I think of that experience in terms of a fragment from Matthew Arnold, the great British poet, which goes, "Our love, let us be true to one another. For the world that seems to lie beyond us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, has really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help from pain. And we are here as on a darkening plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night." Thank you.